Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Has Russia won a foreign policy victory on the back of G20 when it comes to Syria? Or was this merely a welcome victory for common sense? And interestingly, has Vladimir Putin saved Barack Obama from political folly? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest in London, Malik Al-Abdeh. He's a UK-based Syrian journalist. We also have Sunny Hundel. He's a writer and contributor to The Guardian. And sitting with me here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio is Mark Slobodai. He is from the Department of Sociology and International Relations at the Center for Conservative Studies at Moscow State University, and also a 6-year veteran of the U.S. military. Malik, if I can go to you first in London, listening to what Barack Obama said to the American people about Syria, what was the primary message that you got from it? Because, again, it seems extremely convoluted in what is coming out of the White House and the American political elite, and I would say the ripple effect into Europe. So what was your assessment of his speech?
Well, in the same way as Prime Minister David Cameron paid the price for Tony Blair's folly in invading Iraq, I think Barack Obama is paying the price for George Bush's adventure. And, you know, what's the overwhelming consensus, overwhelming feeling in the U.S., as well as the UK, is that we don't want any more foreign adventures, which explains to a great extent why Congress has been reluctant to support President Obama, which also explains why President Obama has been reluctant to launch strikes against Syria. And which is
but Malik, would you also say he hasn't made a good case for it? I mean, there's so many holes in it, and there's very little confirmation of allegations made by different parties on the ground. He hasn't made a good case is the problem as well.
Well, I think had he waited for the UN inspectors to produce a definitive report on where those chemical weapons came from, who launched them, that may have made his case a lot more convincing to Congress and to the U.S. Public. But I think
depending on the outcome of it. Mark, you want to jump in here? Go ahead.
That cannot be the case with the UN inspections, actually. They have an extremely limited mandate, as Jay Carney, the U.S. press spokesman, has repeated ad nauseum, that the inspectors are not allowed to report on anything but whether a chemical agent was used and what kind. They are specifically not allowed to report on who launched the missiles. This is very interesting. The UN mandate has actually been secret at the request of the Security Council, the members who were involved in fashioning the mandate. And the Russian government has revealed that this is because the US, UK, and France demanded this extremely limited mandate.
Sonny, if you read Western media and if you listen to some of the what we could call the party of war, they're not interested in evidence. They've already made their decision that Assad used these weapons and he must be punished for it one way or another. Thus, it seems that, again, going back to President Obama's speech to the American people, he still seems very bent on attacking Syria. It's just how and when.
I think they have made a mistake in trying to make the case for war before showing the evidence. I mean, I am for intervention in Syria, but I think that it requires, I mean, you know, as Malik said, because there's a hangover from Iraq, you need to make the case, you need to explain to people what the evidence is, you need to convince them, you need to convince the public, the MPs, and then say to them, this is what exactly we plan to do in Syria, and this is what our exit strategy is too. And they haven't done that, and because they haven't done that, because they kind of assume that people have faith in the US military and the US establishment, and they have forgotten that people have lost faith, that they have sort of expected the public opinion to go with them, and it hasn't. And that's why you're seeing this wobble now over what exactly is the plan. And even when Chuck Hagel, the defense secretary, was speaking to Congress people, a select committee, there were inconsistencies in what he was saying and what John Kerry was saying in what they wanted to do in Syria. And I think that's part of the problem, that they expected everyone to go along with them.
It's very interesting that you mention that, because I think you can also make a logical, and I'm sorry to use the phrase, common sense assessment of the situation in Syria, irrespective of Iraq, because the evidence, there is no overriding evidence there should be a military strike against Syria at this point. And if there would be a strike by the United States without a United Nations Security Council resolution, it would be illegal under international law and a war crime.
No, not necessarily. The way the United States, I'm assuming, will do this is probably not, they probably won't go for a UN resolution because obviously at the Security Council they will be vetoed down by Russia and China. But I think the case they will make is that this is a humanitarian intervention, and the reason for going into Syria, and this is the JIC report too in the UK saying it's legal because it's a humanitarian intervention and we have to do something about what's going on there. They will make that case anyway. I mean, it depends on how you phrase it, really, and it's just not entirely beyond the realms of impossibility to say if it's not about regime change and this is about humanitarian intervention, that you can say this is still legal.
Well, the law concerning humanitarian intervention follows 3 points. Number one, there's convincing evidence generally accepted by the international community as a whole. I'm reading the law.
Yeah.
Number two, it must be objectively clear that there is no practical alternative to the use of force. Number three, the proposal of the use of force must be necessary and proportionate to the aim of relief of humanitarian need. I'm sorry, gentlemen, Syria does not apply.
Well, I mean...
Okay, well, also you're actually missing another piece there, is that these 3 rules only are specifically within the wider context of the document. It is quite clear that they only apply for the Security Council in making its decisions. If members of the Security Council feel that those conclusions are not met, any one of the permanent 5 members, and uses its veto, then there absolutely can be no legal justification for aggression against another state. And that is indeed, as has been termed at the Nuremberg trials, the supreme crime under international law.
Malik, do you want to jump in there?
Well, yes. I mean, it's rather interesting how the debate over Syria has become a debate over chemical weapons, even though only a fraction of the 100,000 or so people who've been killed have been killed because of chemical weapons. And I think it's a very clever ruse by Bashar al Assad and in cahoots with, of course, with Moscow in calling President Obama's bluff. I mean, when President Obama said that the red lines were use of chemical weapons, and now Bashar al Assad is saying, well, I'm ready to deliver those chemical weapons, put them out of use. Essentially, they've taken the main excuse for U.S. intervention in this case. And we all know from past precedents that Bashar al-Assad only changes his mind, only considers certain actions which he'd rather not do, only under a real threat of military strikes. We saw that in 2005 when, with the murder of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, when there was a UN resolution and he was forced to leave Lebanon. And now we see the same thing.
You're disappointed that there is some kind of diplomatic effort to stop the bloodshed.
Well, it's not
Syria.
about stopping the bloodshed. It's not about stopping the bloodshed. It's about the U.S. not intervening militarily, because had the U.S. launched strikes on Assad, this would have put Russia in a compromising position.
Well, because they're supporters of Assad.
It would have made.
Well, do you think Russia is going to get involved in a military conflict in Syria? That's very doubtful.
No, but it would have set in motion a series of events where Russia would no longer be able to influence events. Bashar al-Assad...
that's why Russia's greatest weapon right now is international law. Sunny, you want to jump in? International law.
Yeah, I mean, Russia's not always known to follow international law in lots of cases in the past. So, I mean, in this case, yes, they have an interest in making sure that we have some form of a diplomatic solution rather than a military solution, because, as Malik said, if there is a military strike by the United States and France and other countries joining, then they are the key drivers of what happens then, rather than Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are right now the main players in what's going on in Syria.
Gentlemen, we'll talk about these other players in a second. I have to jump in here. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm your host, Peter Lavelle. Mark, you look like you wanted to reply.
Yeah, just the accusation of Russia not following international law, particularly when coming from the context of Western countries, including the U.S. and the UK and France, involved in the operations in Libya, the undoubted supreme violation of international law in Iraq, illegal entrance into Afghanistan, extraterritorial, extrajudicial drone strikes around the world, exterminating thousands of people.
Sure, but you've also got Chechnya on the side. You've got loads of other things that I can point fingers at. My point is simply that there's no point playing whataboutery about who has broken more international law.
Gentlemen, if international law can be applied, I agree with. I think everyone on this panel would agree it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
Fine. But if there's an attempt, because we had Mr. Kerry in Moscow not long ago talking about going to Geneva. I follow the Western media quite well. And it's the Americans that can't bring their surrogates to the table. You can scoff at the attempt to deal with chemical weapons, because I agree what was said earlier.
Why wasn't the attempt to deal with chemical weapons?
It has nothing to do with chemical weapons. It has everything to do with regime change. No, Assad was winning on the ground. This is the time to go and level the bloody playing field.
But Russia was opposed to intervention earlier on, so I mean you can say that this is about regime change rather than
Russia's always been against intervention. It's a sovereign country.
But what I'm saying is, I mean, as Malik pointed out earlier, this is on August 21st, when the chemical weapons blew up in suburbs of Damascus and so many people died. That too,
as alleged until we find out conclusively from
we don't know
the United
who did
Nations
it,
team.
but we know that this happened.
Okay.
Let's be clear on that point. We know that chemical weapons were used. The question is who did it. That's a different question. So let's be clear on those facts. There's a separate point to be made about red lines, whether you should have red lines about chemical weapons, and I think that's an important point to be made too. We don't want regimes around the world to start using chemical weapons. We don't want chemical weapons to be used by lots of people, and that's a separate military debate you can have. And there's another debate about how do we stop the bloodshed.
Use them on a regular basis like the United States and some of its allies in the world. I mean, we can go all the way back to Vietnam. It's quite hypocritical that some people have the right to use chemical weapons and other people don't.
But let's not pretend that just dealing with chemical weapons will deal with the bloodshed in Syria, and that's what's not being discussed right now.
Go ahead, jump
Sonny,
in.
you're in support of limited strikes as a deterrent effect for the use of chemical weapons. So would you be in support of limited strikes against the United States and Israel to make sure that they don't use white phosphorus or depleted uranium ammunition in their operations against occupied countries again?
I think the point about chemical weapons is about it's about proportionality. So the fact of the matter is, if you have someone like Bashar al Assad and if we find that he did use chemical weapons and he's got a lot more, I mean, sarin is on a massively different scale than, say, white phosphorus. But the point is about how many people have died and will there be more usage of chemical weapons. I am against the idea of sitting around and watching Syrians die, and whether they're killed by conventional weapons or they're killed by chemical weapons. And I feel that the international community has to do something.
International community, however, is defined, and it's always usually defined in Western parlance as Washington and its friends. But we do have, and I want to go back to the Geneva conference that's proposed. Assad, in one form or another, said that he would go or his surrogates would go to sit down. I think we have to thank Russia for that one way or another. However, we have this threatened use of strikes against Assad. I mean, we could take care of the chemical weapons issue as well if there is a conference. Now, listening to what Barack Obama said to the American people, he said it in the 11th minute of a 15-minute speech about a possible negotiated diplomatic solution. Isn't it still worthwhile to push for some kind of diplomatic resolution? Of course, Obama and everyone else will have egg on their face because Assad might survive a little bit longer. Okay, Sonny, do you want to react to that?
Well, I'll let Malik react. I think he hasn't had a chance.
Okay, Malik, go ahead.
First of all, regarding Geneva and a political settlement, I mean, this has been tried now for well over 2 years.
Has it really been?
2.5 years. Yeah, I think so. I think so. There have been a number of attempts. I think there have been a number of serious attempts to get Bashar al Assad to offer real concessions to his people, including holding a free and fair parliamentary and presidential elections, and all we've seen are sham elections and this kind of...
in the middle of a civil war. In the middle of a civil war.
Bashar al Assad has consistently refused to obey to any ceasefire or any call for stopping of bombing of civilian areas, and he's used even up to Scud missiles now to hit rebel-held cities. So really the onus is on Bashar al Assad to stop his attacks, and I'm sure that the opposition are more than willing and ready to talk.
Is the opposition more than willing to sit down and talk? This is the first time I've heard this in 2 years. Go ahead.
First of all, there is no unified opposition. We're talking about 1,000 different armed insurgent groups, ranging from, as Charles Lister, writing in Foreign Policy, described, going from your foreign-backed thousands of foreign jihadists, including from Western countries who have flocked to the country, to Salafists, to moderate Islamists. And that comprises what the New York Times has described as the whole of the armed insurgency. There is not a single armed opposition group that has agreed to talks.
Who wants to reply to that?
Perhaps because those armed opposition groups are precisely armed. They are militias. They're not political organizations, and they're not geared or trained even to negotiate. The main political body for the Syrian opposition is the Syrian Opposition Coalition.
But they have no power over the armed insurgent group.
They have no power.
No, they do. They have a lot of political influence.
Outside of Syria?
Well, they have a lot of political influence and political leverage over those groups, and they can convince them to abide by a ceasefire if there is a credible offer of negotiations. However, that credible offer has not come. Every time Bashar al-Assad has thrown, let's say, a carrot of offering to negotiate, he's put it within terms that are unacceptable to the opposition. Let's arrange a ceasefire to begin with, and then perhaps we can have a negotiated settlement. But the opposition is not willing to negotiate while Bashar continues to bomb rebel-held cities.
Yeah, and I think there's one other point to emphasize on this, that actually the Syrian government only offered to do something about their chemical weapons, or the Russians offered to intervene in the chemical weapon situation only after the United States was going to a vote on whether it should actually take a military intervention. I mean, why wasn't this offered weeks or months ago, or even over a year ago, and it wasn't? The threat of U.S. intervention has forced the Syrian government to change tack, as well as Russia to change tack, and I think that's why that should remain on the table.
But also it depends on who's responsible for this chemical attack, because you can use a different form of logic, is that the rebels, seeing themselves losing on the battlefield, need a false flag operation to get the attention of the United States.
Well, the Human Rights Watch released a report yesterday saying that actually the Syrian government was most likely the culprit because they have the military technology, they have the missiles, they have the air power to deliver these weaponry. I mean,
most likely is not a good reason to go to war, is it? Most likely.
That was a different question.
Are they experts? Are they experts in this area? Mark,
they spend more time,
Human
I think,
Rights
looking at the issue than
nothing about chemical warfare.
Oh, Mark,
I'm a veteran of the military. I'm a veteran of the U.S. military. Human Rights Watch, which is headed by a former U.S. State Department employee, knows absolutely nothing about the use of chemical weapons on a battlefield or off.
Well, let me put it this way. That was a proper report that after they went to the ground and they tried to get evidence from what was going on the ground. I think the danger of people saying, well, I'm an expert and here I am sitting in London, Washington, and saying that therefore I know better than what's going on the ground in Syria seems to me a bit of a bizarre dichotomy.
I think that actually the evidence so far points overwhelmingly to Bashar al-Assad using those weapons, including the comments made by the former president of Iran, Rafsanjani, who actually openly accused the regime of stupidity by using those weapons. And I think the evidence also suggests that perhaps there was a stake in the dosage, that perhaps the regime didn't mean to fire as many missiles as potent as chemicals.
So these are people that are experts in dealing with these weapons. They made a mistake. Okay. Well, maybe just a rebel dropped it by accident. All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to station identification. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Mark, again, it seems a lot of people are jumping to conclusions because they want Assad to be held responsible, and so people can make these decisions. And you have President Obama very quickly saying, putting force on the table without even the United Nations inspections report.
The question of who is responsible for this chemical attack that killed an unknown number of people, somewhere between 200 on the French estimate up to 1,600 on the United States estimate, which really shows how much we actually know about what happened here. The U.S. intelligence, which has been criticized in a report by former U.S. intelligence officials as basically being entirely cooked in order to provide a pretext, consists of three essential pieces of information. One is videos posted on open source media, which means look at YouTube. Two, social media posts, which they refer to. And three, they say some other multiple intelligence streams which we can't tell you about, which brings back eerily to mind the intelligence, the biolabs and so on that was presented as proof for an intervention in the United States.
I don't think that's entirely accurate, because the UN inspections team did go into suburbs of Damascus 5 days after the 21st of August attack, and they went to collect samples, and they weren't given enough time to collect samples and get the information from there, and I think that should be done properly. But this idea that they're getting their information about chemical weapons entirely from YouTube videos is just absurd.
Hey, gentlemen, I think we all should wait for the UN report, and hopefully Syria won't be attacked for without
Syria
reason,
is being attacked
cause.
right now.
Okay.
Not
by American
tomahawks,
not by American tomahawks. Okay, Malik, if I can go to you. I mean, what is the calculus here in using military? I mean, if the Assad regime is painfully aware that it could be attacked and forcefully by the United States, don't you think by now it's pretty much moved out of those buildings and those command centers? And I mean, what would be the point of the attack now? I mean, Obama is really just painted himself into a horrible corner. And he's humiliating himself as a president. What's the next step? Because obviously you want a military intervention.
Well, what I would like to see is Bashar al Assad not ruling Syria anymore, him leaving power. I think this is what the majority of Syrians want. This is why they came out in the beginning, to demonstrate against
his
regime.
We don't know that. We don't really know.
We do,
taking public opinion polls during a civil war is not an easy
well,
thing.
Why do you think there is a civil war, just out of interest? Do you think that people are having a civil war just for fun, or do you think that they're rising up against Assad because they dislike him?
I think they want to establish a Islamic state in Iraq and the Levant is the reason for the civil war.
Who's driving this civil war? Mark, you want to repeat what you said?
The motivation of the majority of the armed insurgency is to establish...
I mean, I've never heard of people from an entire country being just painted as Islamists and as Al-Qaeda just so brazenly. I mean, at the end of the day, 2 million Syrians have been driven to camps in other countries. 6 million people have been displaced. 100,000 people have been killed. These people are ordinary Syrians. They're not Al-Qaeda. They're not Islamists. And they have been killed by Assad because he didn't want them. He wanted to teach them a lesson.
Why have 2 million people left? Why have 2 million people left? Just
because of the bombardment, I assume. Well, why else would you leave if you're being bombarded? Why else would you want to leave your home and your family?
If someone said, convert to Islam or I'll cut your head off, that's a good reason to leave too.
This is a gross. Come on. Let's just be sensible about this, please. We all know Al-Qaeda's forces number no more than 15,000. Whereas the Free Syrian Army combined can muster over 100,000. So let's not portray this as being an Al-Qaeda-inspired plot.
Okay, Mark, is it? Would you like to reply? Would you like to reply to that, Mark?
Yeah, that's a completely incorrect assessment of the armed insurgency. We're talking a total of about 100,000 forces, and multiple U.S. experts have concurred on this, and we're letting on U.S. sources. Joshua Landis, Aaron Lund, Charles Lister, etc. So we have 100,000 forces under arms. 1/3 of those belong to the Free Syrian Army. But of the Free Syrian Army, and I can quote, that brings the number of Islamist fighters in the secular Free Syrian Army to 40,000 out of 50,000, because most of the majority of the forces in the Free Syrian Army actually belong to the Syrian Islamic fighting group, and at least one brigade of the Syrian Islamic faction. Then we have Jabhat al-Nusra, we have the Syrian Islamic Liberation Front, we have the Syrian Islamic Front, we have numerous other groups possibly supported by Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Of course, you overlook the fact that there are Iranian militias, Iraqi militias, Lebanese Hezbollah fighting with Bashar al Assad. Let's not look at this in one-dimensional kind of way. If you're suggesting that the opposition is a sectarian Islamic extremist movement, essentially, then you can also look at the other side and say, well, this is also a Shiite extremist, fundamentalist movement that wishes to create a Shiite crescent in the region.
Gentlemen, we're going exactly in the direction I wanted to go to. Malik, what is your assessment of Saudi Arabia's role in this? Qatar, to some extent, Israel, are they playing a positive role in keeping the civil war going, keeping the instability going, or are they interested in some kind of solution?
Well, if you're talking about the official Saudi line, Saudi Arabia's main foe in the region is Iran, and Saudi Arabia's government views the Syrian conflict in terms of weakening Iran's regional grip. If you're talking about Saudi's unofficial, let's say the Islamist current within Saudi Arabia, which is not affiliated to the government, and actually in some ways is antagonistic towards the government, they're supporting the Salafists in Syria. But the Saudi government actually is supporting the more moderate forces within the opposition, such as Michel Kilo, for example, is supported by Saudi Arabia. He's a Christian, secular figure within the opposition. Also a number of Free Syrian Army brigades that are known not to be Islamists, also supported by the Saudi government.
So could you sum up, what do you think is their role? Is it a positive role or a negative role in keeping the civil war going?
They are in support of anything that would lead to the downfall of Bashar al Assad. At the same time,
it doesn't matter how many Syrians have to die, as long as they get their goal. It's all about Iran. It's not about the Syrian people.
Well, they are supporting the struggle of the Syrian people against a dictator, and certainly Syrians have a right to receive that support.
Yeah, I think we have to take a look at the minorities in Syria that have largely been in support of the Syrian government, or at least in opposition to the what it could, I think, accurately be described as Sunni sectarian armed insurgency, whether that's jihadist, Salafist, or Islamist. There is an ongoing ethnic cleansing of Christians going on in the country right now in the city of
and
Maluba.
Syrian Muslims too, don't forget.
Yes, good point. Good point.
Yes, also of Shias, Alawites. The Kurds are currently now, as much as they tried to stay out of it, also being attacked by jihadist and Salafist forces in the east. So this is really a question of which Syrian people. Everyone likes to say that they're acting in defense of the Syrian people, but this is an ethno-religious sectarian conflict. And the Syrian government has been the only one, whether it certainly cannot be characterized as any kind of democracy. It is an authoritarian state, but at least it was a secular, multinational, and multi-ethnic state. And it is only the Syrian government that is acting now to protect the minorities.
All right, gentlemen, we're almost out of time. I'd like to ask all three of my guests here, Malik, first, the ultimate outcome of this conflict will be partition? Yes or no?
Well, at the moment, I think yes. De facto partition of the country, unfortunately, and I don't think any Syrian would like to see this happen, although I see it as an unavoidable future.
Okay, Sonny?
I think if the conflict carries on and there is no military intervention, or at least a way to force Assad out, then there will be partition. I think otherwise there's got to be some way of maintaining, the only way to maintain the country would be to get rid of Assad.
Mark?
Yeah, I also agree that partition is the only answer at this point. I don't see the Syrian government being able to reestablish law and order over large portions of the countryside that have been taken over by this extremist elements, many of it spilled over from Iraq.
All right, gentlemen, we all agreed on one point at the end of the program. I want to thank Malik and Sonny in London. I want to thank Mark here sitting in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio with me. Thanks for listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Stay with us.
This is very interesting. The UN mandate has actually been secret at the request of the Security Council, the members who were involved in fashioning the mandate. And the Russian government has revealed that this is because the US, UK, and France demanded this extremely limited mandate.
Sonny, if you read Western media and if you listen to some of the what we could call the party of war, they're not interested in evidence. They've already made their decision that Assad used these weapons and he must be punished for it one way or another. Thus, it seems that... Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Has Russia won a foreign policy victory on the back of G20 when it comes to Syria? Or was this merely a welcome victory for common sense? And interestingly, has Vladimir Putin saved Barack Obama from political folly? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest in London, Malik Al-Abdeh. He's a UK-based Syrian journalist. We also have Sunny Hundel. He's a writer and contributor to The Guardian. And sitting with me here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio is Mark Slobodda. He is from the Department of Sociology and International Relations at the Center for Conservative Studies at Moscow State University, and also a 6-year
definitive report on where those chemical weapons came from, who launched them. That may have made his case a lot more convincing to Congress and to the U.S. Public. But I think
depending on the outcome, depending on the outcome of it. Mark, you want to jump in here? Go ahead.
That cannot be the case with the UN inspections, actually. They have an extremely limited mandate, as Jay Carney, the U.S. press spokesman, has repeated ad nauseum, that the inspectors are not allowed to report on anything but whether a chemical agent was used and what kind. They are specifically not allowed to report on who launched the missiles.
What's the overwhelming consensus, overwhelming feeling in the US as well as the UK is that we don't want any more foreign adventures, which explains to a great extent why Congress has been reluctant to support President Obama, which also explains why President Obama has been reluctant to launch strikes against Syria, and which is something.
But Malik, would you also say he hasn't made a good case for it? I mean, there's so many holes in it, and there's very little confirmation of allegations made by different parties on the ground. He hasn't made a good case is the problem as well.
Well, I think had he waited for the UN inspectors to produce a report.
Veteran of the U.S. military. Malik, if I can go to you first in London, listening to what Barack Obama said to the American people about Syria, what was the primary message that you got from it? Because, again, it seems extremely convoluted in what is coming out of the White House and the American political elite, and I would say the ripple effect into Europe. So what was your assessment of his speech?
Well, in the same way as Prime Minister David Cameron paid the price for Tony Blair's folly in invading Iraq, I think Barack Obama is paying the price for George Bush's adventure. And